Again, my name is Mikkel. I'm from consulting company focused on B2B sales, marketing growth, and commercial due diligence. Plus 30 people operating out of Copenhagen. That's not so interesting. Today we are here to talk about go-to-market, engagement model. Before we jump into that topic, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro to what we call go-to-market efficiency, a topic that is really top of the agenda for all commercial leaders, more or less, in this day and age for different reasons. We're going to open that up a little bit, and then we're going to frame the topic of engagement models under the banner of go-to-market efficiency. Then we're going to unpack this topic of engagement model and the topic of segmentation, because these two concepts are really married together. And then finally, I'm going to show a short case on how to set up a virtual sales team and by doing so improve your go-to-market efficiency. So go-to-market, what's the state of go-to-market? Well, you can say, if we had to set up a little bit of a metaphor of where we are, right? Imagine that you're walking into a casino, right? Sleek, high-tech slot machine, right in front of you, right? It says go to market, right? You put in your $1 bill and expect, of course, to win, but instead it spits out 91 cents and say, okay, let's try again. You put in the 91 cents and it spits out 86 cents. Then you put in the 86 cents and it spits out 81 cents, and you keep going and going and going like that. And then you ask, kind of like the pit boss, what's going on? The thing is broken. And then he answers, no, really not. It's just how B2B works nowadays. And he's kind of right, because at least if you're looking at some SaaS companies, listed SaaS companies, what we're seeing is that each investment in sales and marketing only brings back, each $1 investment in sales and marketing only brings back 31 cents in revenue. Right? And this number has been dropping and dropping. And that's, of course, a major issue. So, because at some point, someone in the board, or maybe, leadership team or board level is going to ask, what are we actually getting out of our investment in sales and marketing? Should we maybe instead deploy those money and spend them on R&D? Should we maybe even send them back to shareholders? Whatnot? There's a lot of different options here. So it's key for us to understand what is our go-to-market efficiency and what are we doing to improve that go-to-market efficiency. And this is happening across the board. This is medtech. Again, what we're seeing in medtech, for example, is that operating margins are actually falling quite a lot. Growth also keeps shrinking. Massive cost of sales and marketing has stayed the same, right? So we're seeing less and less incremental revenue, less and less incremental EBITDA, same sales and marketing investment. So okay, that was a bit of a tee up, and it's just, I think it's super important on how do we talk about segmentation engagement models, because this topic of go-to-market efficiency, we're seeing it gaining more and more traction, right? Profitable growth, efficient growth, these different terms, and I think segmentation engagement models is a very concrete and specific way to address the underlying root causes. Because what is this all about? Well, I have this framing that one of the most important go-to-market efficiency levers is certainly matching the right sellers and channels to the right accounts, and then hardwiring the discipline so that resources dynamically follow potential. That's really the sort of the header of this whole topic, making sure that when we invest in sales and marketing, we invest according to potential. And if there's not potential, maybe we shouldn't invest that much. That's the key sort of guiding principle for everything we'll discuss in this webinar. And yes, you could also talk sort of territory design and coverage optimization. I feel like that's a little bit of a squeezing the lemon. We can definitely squeeze out a few percentage points of efficiency here, but looking fundamentally at our engagement model and segmentation model is really what allows us to 5 or 10x the return on this investment, right? So we're planting lemon trees, less about squeezing lemons. We're really rethinking how we do things. We're innovating in how we go to market. Just a little bit of an historical perspective, and this I think is a general trend that we're seeing, that for many years back in the days, even, the sales, especially sort of the sales teams, were set up based on typical field-based account managers, right? Sales reps spend most of their time sort of driving around, visiting routes. In-person visits were the main way of interacting, and we could sort of calculate our coverage and capacity by number of account, expected visits, and then we got this logic of how much each sales rep could cover, and then we have our sort of capacity map. And that worked very well for that day and age. I think the major issue is that we brought a lot of the assumptions that this model was built on, brought those into the new era where both how we can sell enabled by technology and all these things has changed, but also how buyers actually buy has changed. So what we're seeing is, of course, historically, marketing was mostly like a bit of an awareness function, right? Creating awareness that, hey, we're here, our company exists, we're great. Customer support did a little bit of addressed a little bit of the sales process that you see on the x-axis here, right? For very low complexity sales. The rest was more or less covered by the field sales team. And again, worked well for many years, but I think there's an opportunity to revisit this traditional setup in many ways. So I want to highlight a couple of few key pointers here, right? First of all, marketing and growth teams can now do way more. For very sort of low complexity types of buying, they can actually take over the full buying process end to end, from awareness to order and account management even, right? So full end-to-end ownership. At the same time, we're seeing inside sales has grown up in many ways, right? It started out as a sort of a glorified customer support or telemarketing team. It can now take on more and more types of buying, but also take on more and more of the actual buying process, right? We still need consultative selling, but I think we need to be more acutely aware when is the sort of high stake, when are the sort of the buying situations high stakes enough for us to invest with real people going there and advising them on how to buy and what to buy, right? So we still need consultative selling, but that also puts new demands on the salespeople to be able to add a lot of value in those situations, because if they don't add value, it might as well just be fully automated, right? Customer success is also increasingly being sort of surfacing in a lot of organizations, where you are leaving the sort of keeping the customers happy, maybe even putting on some sort of expansion, accountability and whatnot on this separate team that takes on the role of making sure that the product, that the customers get value from the product, see value from the product, and also, of course, renew the contract in the final end or buy more, right? And then in this new reality, where a lot of this is also fueled by data and technology, of course, also setting up teams like revenue operations is extremely important. So we have the same view of how we're actually faring in terms of the funnel and whatnot, and making sure that we're operating in a data-backed and process-consistent way. And we keep innovating into our go-to-market engine room. So revenue operations also increasingly a function that's being set up in a lot of companies, also outside of software. So before we get into this topic, that was just general map. It's important to, I think, make a few key pointers, right? Because what is a universal trend that we're seeing across the board is more digital engagement, more enabled by data, more enabled by AI and all these things, right? That's a key thing. But in order for us to unpack this concept, I think it's also critical to understand what are some of the key tenets of this overall transformation that we need to get in place. Before we get to how we can revisit our different engagement models, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that proper segmentation is really the bedrock of a proper engagement model, because it's going to inform so many of the choices that we'll make in terms of how we engage the customers that we're targeting. And yes, it's probably some sort of variation of the classical size times potential that you all know, and then we can call them diamond, gold, bronze, whatnot. It doesn't matter that much. I think it's really key. It's less about how the segmentation model looks and much more about how it's actually built and how it's used in many ways, right? Some suggestions on my side is to keep the inputs lean and auditable, right? So make sure that we have a few sets of very clear fields with named owners in them, And then we have maybe sort of ranges from low to medium to high instead of very fine-grained scores. And again, to the extent possible, make these scores as objective as possible, right? I've seen models where it's put entirely on the individual rep to rate an account against this framework. And of course, that creates loads of different types of problems, super difficult to maintain, it creates a very subjective look, and suddenly all accounts are diamond accounts, right, for example. And again, the key is not to say that all accounts should be diamonds, for sure not. We should have some sort of distribution across this full spectrum of different segments that would allow us to create different engagement models. If all accounts sit in the same part of the map, we have a big issue, right? In a lot of global to local organizations, also important, of course, to understand how do we create a framework that works both at a local scale, but also is globally coherent, so to say. And the way we typically see it is one logic, but it's sort of versionized to the individual countries, right? To make sure that it reflects the market reality. It might be that the ranges are different from the different markets, or we look at the different parameters and the weight between those parameters, but the logic is mainly the same. Of course, embedded in CRM, that's totally obvious, but I think it's a key enabler, of course, that the CRM is still in many ways the system of record and the main operating system for sales organization. So it should really also be firmly embedded in the CRM. And then, of course, refresh governance often, right? Is it actually being used? Is it being used to guide behavior? Is it being refreshed in the proper cadence? And all these different logics, so to say. It also means that we should also build our coverage model around how we set up our team based on these different segments, and it could potentially mean that we should set up some sort of coverage council that allows us to ongoingly assess whether the accounts are placed in the right parts of the segmentation model. And then finally, the most important thing, the segmentation model should help us drive behavior. So again, we get back to the engagement model, but can we map plays, service lists, and all these things that goes into a engagement model against these different cells? Can we align our coverage models against these different cells as well, right? A diamond account needs a lot more love and care than a light on exit account, right? And then we need to constantly assess whether we actually have higher win rates on the key cells that we believe that we should win, right? Whether it's the harvest or the diamond or the build cells, of course. So segmentation is really, really crucial. Even though we're talking digital engagement models, if we don't have our foundational piece in place, everything that follows downstream is going to fall to the wayside, and it's going to be extremely difficult to use as a strategic vehicle to manage our resources and deploy our resources against the right parts of the market. And when it comes to segmentation, I think it's also important to sort of realize that, of course, not all of these different segments are created equally. So really, setting up this map and making sure that we have everything in place and we can actually map the accounts against the map is super crucial. One thing I want to just want to highlight, and this is an example from a client, it's extremely important to look at when you start to look at your different segments and you start to bundle those segments into those different accounts into different types of segments. It's interesting to look at how does the distribution actually look across these different types of segments that we've done. So this is an analysis we did for a client where you can see count of companies, total ARR. And it should typically, as sort of a pressure test of your segmentation model, should typically go something like this. Is there an inverse relationship between the number of accounts and the revenue per account, right? So the fewer accounts there is in the given segment, the more revenue there should be for each account. You can see here, for example, strategic accounts for this company is 1.18% of the total universe of accounts, but 23.5% of total ARR, right? And then in the bottom of this, where we have whatever we call them core accounts, they make up 65% of the total accounts, right? But only 12% of revenue ARR. So you can see you would have a massive drop in ARR per company between the strategic accounts and the core accounts. And this is a simple test that you should always do. And if you don't see these patterns, then there's something wrong with the model. So that was segmentation, yes, and there's many ways to do it, but I think it's just important to keep in mind that that's really the bedrock of designing proper engagement models. And that's the next topic that we're gonna open up here. A little bit of a busy slide, but let's dwell on it for a few minutes here. What we want to do is, based on our segments, define different engagement models. What is not given is that each segment gets their own engagement model. It might be that several segments get either more than one engagement model, or there's one engagement model that covers several segments. So that's actually not given, but it's always married to the segmentation model one way or the other. And what's getting increasingly interesting, I think, if you ask me, is that this sort of binary view between a digital sort of engagement model, it might be a digital self-serve, totally PLG-led motion where the customers sign up, get awareness from the product, try the product, buy the product, expand within, everything happens within the product, or e-commerce and whatnot, fully digital experience, versus the classical super bespoke account manager-led strategic high-touch white glove experience. Those two extremes, there's a lot of hybrid models in between, and I think that's actually where a lot of interesting stuff is really also happening, and a lot of innovation. What's key here is to understand what are the different models we can apply, right? We have those two extremes, but it also might be that we do a combined model, right? Number two, as you see here, where we have a hybrid model, where there's a few physical account manager-led interactions, but also a sort of a supportive environment, which is more hybrid, right? In whatever shape and form that comes, right? All the way down to also still having a personal touch, having a account manager that sort of owns a client, but it's maybe owned from a nearshore multilingual sort of customer success hub, right? Where people only work from the office. So they can probably handle 4 to 6 times as many accounts as a typical account manager if the team is set up in a proper way, right? So there's a lot of different models to flesh out. And on top of that, what you see here is the yellow arrows to the left. It's not just about how you service, it's also what are the different motions then that we want to run, or the different plays we want to run against each account, right? Because a lot of accounts might have a upselling motion. There might be some sort of renewal motion. There might gonna be some sort of executive sponsorship motion, whatnot. So clarifying these different motions is also extremely important in order for us to make the engagement model operational, so to say. And I think a key point here is also that actually a hard truth is that a lot of customers are actually showing a little bit more appetite for digital first engagement in many companies, right? Compared to what companies tell us, right? They say, hey, customers don't want any digital engagement; they want personal on-site visits from a known person, and that's, I think, is partly true. A lot of customers, they prioritize problem resolution more than they prioritize coffee chats, to be frank, right? And that doesn't mean that salespeople don't add a lot of value, but you need to be acutely aware about how do you bring value into these meetings, into these physical interactions. If not, it could probably be a virtual one. Another interesting thing that we're seeing again and again is up to, if you assess a sort of a distribution of customers, is that typically up to 40% of smaller accounts go untouched by account managers, right? So typically they're sort of totally left on their own. In reality, they are often accounts, right? And again, digital means whether fully automated or virtually sort of engaged, a virtual engagement allows us for creating some sort of touches that are much more financially viable than sending a account manager out to the account, or simply expecting your strategic account manager also to handle this long tail of accounts. So what you'll end up when you do this exercise, you're clarifying different types of engagement models. You typically also end up shuffling accounts around in new ways. You also end up looking at the sales role with more sort of in fresh light. Maybe we need some sort of strategic account manager types. Maybe we need more virtual salespeople, dedicated virtual salespeople that work by the phone and can handle 4 to 6 times as many accounts, much more data backed, much more sort of technology enabled, right? And maybe we can run a lot of our motions or even totally transition some of our accounts to a fully virtual model. So a lot of things are actually sort of opened up when you start this discussion, and it always starts with segmentation, of course. I just want to take a bit of a deep dive into segmentation, which I believe is one of the most into inside sales, which I think is one of the interesting levers, and a lever that has changed a lot over the last few years. Because to be frank, 5-7 years ago, inside sales was kind of emerging as a interesting topic, right? Setting up a dedicated team of salespeople that sits inside the company, don't go out visiting. It's been around for years and ages, but the term of inside sales was increasing in popularity. What I think happened in the beginning, and that's kind of the legacy part, is that it was mostly sort of a rebranded telemarketing function, right? Hire a bunch of young people, don't give them a lot of enablement, set up a super aggressive commission structure, a phone book, or maybe a virtual phone book and a phone, let's go, right? For some companies it worked, for some it didn't, but I think much more interesting is how inside sales as a concept has matured and evolved since those days, right? Now you can if you do proper sort of preparation and enablement of these different functions, you can apply inside sales in a much more surgical manner, right? It might be that you have a long tail of accounts where you actually want to assign total ownership of those accounts to telemarketing, to inside sales. It might also be that you want to do some sort of signal-based outreach. It might be intent, product usage, risk triggers, all of these things where you see a chart popping up. Inside sales is great at working with data and being, looking at data and reacting based on data. So you can also set up a team that does purely sort of signal-based outreach. Replenishment and orders, where customers are basically looking for a fast quote to PO price, where there's sort of very firm price and pack guardrails. You don't need an account manager to handle those types of replenishment and reorders. Inside sales is also great for that. Trial and PLG assist, if you have someone trying out the product, either whether it's a software or a physical product. Inside sales is also a great vehicle to convert those to paying and recurring customers. It could also be another use case, could be sort of win-back and dormant reactivation. If you lost some clients, or some clients went total stall, trying to set up a motion where you try to win back and reactivate those accounts is also a very meaningful use case. There's even more use cases under the sun that's not so important. The key is that this function has really matured, enabled by data and by, I think, better support, to be frank, as well. And that allows for us to be more creative in terms of putting them at play when it comes to setting up our commercial organization. I think the interesting thing, of course, looking 5 years ahead, is if things can be moved to inside sales, when can it actually be handled entirely autonomous by AI? But maybe that's a bit out in the future, right? So let's see. But that's just a reflection on our side. Another thing that's important to consider when we talk engagement models, I think, is that landing and developing customers is really a team sport. So make sure that your partners, customer success, and marketing are all ingrained part of the engagement model. This is not a sales-only discussion, right? And why is that interesting? I think there's a lot of different use cases, again, under the sun here. But it might be that when it comes to strategic enterprises, for example, that marketing should run an ABM motion. So that should be hardwired into your engagement model. So it's not something that marketing feel like they can pick up maybe or something. No, it's actually agreed that marketing is a crucial part of running our strategic enterprise play. And of course, it might also be that strategic enterprises or very big accounts with a very big ACV, we can actually set up a separate customer success function. We can afford that, quote unquote, to make sure that they are happy, keep buying, and stays around, right? Depending on how you segment your base and whatnot, there's loads of different motions, and marketing, partnerships, and customer success can really be brought into play in many different ways. But the key point here is to do not make this a sales only exercise. Keep considering how different functions also fit into these discussions and this framework. Just want to share a couple of stories from the wild here on how a fresh look at engagement model also can unlock commercial value, of course. One example is from a SaaS company where what we saw is that more than 40% of paying customers had no touches at all from their assigned local AM, right? A very classical model. Local AM, of course, a blend between physical meeting, phone-based meeting, emails, virtual meetings, all these things, right? The big issue is that a lot of the account managers had plus 200 accounts, right? So what happens is that the long tail of accounts where there's not a lot of money, to be frank, to be found, they are totally left on their own. So what this company did is they shifted the ownership of these long tail accounts to an English-speaking customer success hub, right? That handled troubleshooting, renewals, basic expansion moves, just started calling people up. What they saw is that customers suddenly felt seen. They haven't heard from this company in ages. Suddenly something shows interest. And there was also a clear sort of uptick in expansion revenue, right? Suddenly they wanted more seats. This is a software company, wanted to buy more seats, or some of them even expanded into different modules. And of course, also a lot happier customers that will hopefully review in due time. So that's one way to innovate in how you go to market. Maybe set up a separate team that takes ownership of the long tail of accounts. Also in the SaaS space, another story is a company that was moving up market, but they had a lot of legacy SMB customers that was sort of left in no man's land, and they were leaking massively. One issue was, of course, the product was now increasingly an enterprise fit product, but another issue was that very basic questions, systems that weren't working, they could not get anyone to show any interest in just making sure that the system actually works. So what they did is they set up a scaled customer success digital motion that was digital first with a light human safety net. So a lot of communication via mail inside the system, fully automated, but there was an opportunity or possibility for a sort of a virtual human interaction as well. So that was the human safety net. So that also meant that the CSMs working in this particular setup could handle more than 500 accounts, right? So what they could see is that the leakage, while continuing, and that's a little bit deliberate in many ways, but it was still halved, right? At a close to zero cost to serve, right? Because the investment setting up this team was very, very small. So yeah, that also worked quite well. Another company in industrials, they could see revenue were actually inching up, right? But selling costs were also actually ballooning even more percentage-wise than the revenues were increasing, because what had happened is that the order size had sort of shrunk to a third of what it used to be, right? So what happened in reality is that the field rep were now driving around to different premises, selling 5K euro reorders. So they were simply just buying a few more of what they've always bought. That entailed a physical visit and a physical order, bespoke order, and a lot of sort of processing of that order, right? So what they tried out is to set up an inside sales team to take over replenishment and these small quotes. So they set up a sort of a threshold of the size of the quotes and worked specifically on replenishment orders to keep revenue stable, growth stable, with a much lower cost to serve. Less travel cost, to be frank, half the salary of your field reps, and they could handle way more accounts than what your field rep could actually do. So all upside, so to say. Yes. So that was a bit of some introductions to the topic of engagement model. Before we go into sort of a more specific case, I just want to share the perspective that there's so much room to innovate here. It starts with segmentation. Do we fully understand how we want to segment the market, how we map those different accounts against this framework that we've built? Have we operationalized it, making sure that it's actually fit for purpose, it's being used, it's hardwired into our CRM, and all these things, of course, extremely important. And then when it comes to engagement models, so much room to innovate here, try new things out, new team compositions, setting up new roles, using technology, data, AI to automate a lot of stuff, right? So all with the aim of improving our go-to-market efficiency. So super bullish on that. Yes, I also just want to show a case very specifically on a customer that did some of these things and got a lot of value through it. So I'm just going to show you specifically what happened. Yeah, historically they had this very typical sort of account classification model, right? Very close to what we saw before. They use relationship strength and attractiveness instead of size and potential, but still the point remains. They had some different segments as part of this segmentation model, where they said, okay, C and D accounts, those are inside sales, and all A and B accounts are field sales owned, right? So we split up our account universe for these two different functions. Then we have some guidance on how many visits these different accounts should get. Some of them, of course, being remote because they're owned by inside sales. Some of them being in person because they're owned by field sales, right? I think an interesting thing is when you look at the data, so we dived a little bit into the data, what was interesting to see is that while we did a lot of work in the sales organization, none of the accounts actually got the visits that quote unquote our guidance tool dictated, right? So what you can see here on the right is the share of accounts that got below minimum required number of interactions. So it's not so bad for the major accounts A and B, well, still bad, but not so bad. But C and D got way below the expected number of visits, right? And this is only focusing on the A, B, C, D accounts, not the C and C that you see here. So a big issue here, right? We have some guidance for good reasons, but we are really not adhering to that today. What's even more interesting is when you start to look at correlation between time allocated to accounts and how many visits they got and unit sales, we could see that there's actually really strong correlations. So the more interactions, the more sales. And of course, this is a correlation. So we're not showing causality just by this chart, but it's a pretty good indication that the more we invest, the more we are present, the more they buy. Sounds quite intuitive. But if you combine this view with this, that's an issue because we're not really living up to our own interaction guidance parameters. So what about if we look a little bit about how we can change things around? We say, what about field sales? They cover all the A and B accounts, right? But even the A and B accounts needs even more visits. So that's what you're seeing in your second column, right? So we're adding more capacity. So the field sales should do even more visits, right? At the same time, a play could be to transfer the C and D accounts to inside sales, and then create a small reduction in what we call T and C accounts, right? So what would happen is that we actually don't need more inside field sales reps, right? Because we're taking away some accounts. We also know some accounts, the NB accounts, need a bit more visits, but we're also taking away certain accounts and placing them with the inside sales team. Again, under the assumption that actually inside sales can potentially handle more accounts than what we originally thought, right? So that's the general math here. So the change, of course, also means that we need to do an additional investment in our inside sales team because, yes, we're taking away time from the field reps. Those field reps need to spend that liberated time by ramping up the number of interactions they have with A and B accounts. So we need to hire more inside salespeople. And we did sort of an extensive business case on this, also modeling what would it mean in terms of visits, and with the correlation between number of visits and revenue, what would the impact be in terms of revenue? If we were to adhere 100% to our interaction guidelines, that was sort of the premise as well. Interestingly enough, both the business case and actually reality, when it was piloted in a country, showed a very, very positive case. And why did it do that? First and foremost, the big delta was we now spend even more time with our A and B accounts where we know the majority of revenue is coming from. That's one improvement lever. Another improvement lever is a lot of our long tail accounts got no attention whatsoever at all. And now we could suddenly invest in those accounts through our inside sales team. And then this mid-level of accounts that we now transfer to the inside sales teams, they were also getting way too few visits before. They were actually quite satisfied with the being transferred to the inside sales teams, but again, because now suddenly they got some attention. Maybe they did not get the physical visit. Maybe they did not get the sort of typical named salesperson that they've known for 20 years, but it was way better than nothing, which is in reality the alternative to what we're seeing here. And again, the investment in inside sales, much smaller than field sales, and they can handle way more accounts because they don't need to travel and do as extensive planning as the field reps did. So a very sort of meaningful change. And again, the learning was actually inside sales can take on more accounts than what we originally a few years back thought was possible. So that's a key learning as well. So keep pushing the envelope here in terms of setting up your commercial organization, but all based on a proper understanding of how to segment the market.